In the heart of Africa, beneath the red soil and the golden sun, a new kind of war is being fought. Not a war of armies or weapons, but one of information, microscopic, invisible, and yet more valuable than oil or gold. This is the story of how an entire continent awoke to the realization that its most sacred possession, its genetic identity, was being quietly taken. For decades, Africa was seen as the world's raw resource base. From diamonds to copper, from cocoa to crude oil, every century brought a new kind of extraction. But in the 21st century, a new frontier emerged, the extraction of DNA. It began softly with white-coated scientists, humanitarian missions, and promises of medical progress. Research teams arrived offering partnerships, vaccine trials, and public health programs. They came not as colonizers, but as collaborators. Behind the banners of science and global cooperation, another kind of map was being drawn, not of land, but of genomes. And it was a map that would decide the future of biotechnology, medicine, and even agriculture. At first, it seemed harmless. Hospitals and clinics collected blood samples, universities partnered with Western labs, and data was shared freely in the name of research. But over time, the flow of samples out of the continent grew larger. Vials of blood, swabs of saliva, tissue fragments, all sent overseas to state-of-the-art facilities for analysis. What few realized was that these samples represented more than just medical data. They were blueprints, genetic blueprints, capable of revealing ancestral traits, immunity patterns, and even resistance to diseases, information that could be turned into patents worth billions. By 2023, hundreds of thousands of genetic samples from across Africa were held in foreign biobanks. Few governments had oversight. Few citizens even knew their DNA had been shared. It was quiet, systematic, and legal, thanks to vague contracts written in technical language. To the companies collecting them, it was just data. To Africa, it was a silent robbery of its biological soul. And then in a small West African nation, someone said, enough. Captain IbrahimTraoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, was not a scientist. He was a soldier, a man forged by years of struggle against instability and exploitation. But what he discovered through intelligence reports and health ministry briefings would shake his belief in international cooperation. In late 2024, a confidential review reached his desk. It revealed that under the guise of medical research, several international organizations had collected thousands of DNA samples from local citizens. The samples had been shipped abroad, not for immediate healthcare improvement, but for long-term genomic mapping. Foreign biotech firms were studying African DNA to unlock clues for drug development, vaccine design, and even genetically modified crops. And the profits from those discoveries were being patented, owned, and sold, far from African soil. Traoré called it what it was, genetic colonization. He summoned his ministers and scientists to a high-level meeting. For hours, they reviewed contracts signed by previous administrations, pages of jargon referring to biological cooperation and shared genomic studies. But the reality was clear. African biological material was leaving the continent, while the technology, profit, and control stayed in the West. In a fiery address to the Council of Ministers, Traoré said, "They took our gold. They took our oil. Now they come for our blood, our code, our future." His words echoed across the capital. Within weeks, Burkina Faso suspended all foreign genetic research programs and ordered an immediate audit of all biomedical partnerships. International organizations protested. Western embassies issued statements about scientific cooperation and global progress. But Traoré stood firm. For him, this was not about politics. It was about sovereignty. As news of Burkina Faso's stance spread, it resonated deeply across Africa. In Kenya, reports emerged that a global research company had patented a gene variant found in East African communities, a variant linked to disease resistance. In Nigeria, seed companies were accused of mapping the genetic code of native crops, modifying them, and claiming ownership under international patent laws. And in South Africa, universities quietly handed over thousands of biological samples collected over decades of research to foreign biotech firms. It became clear Africa's genes were the new oil, and the scramble had already begun. In Ouagadougou, Traoré met with scientists from across the continent. One of them, Dr. Amina Kabore, a molecular biologist, summarized the issue simply. "Our genes are the blueprint of our people. When we lose control of them, we lose control of our destiny. African researchers had long complained of being excluded from high-level data analysis. They collected samples, sent them abroad, and never saw the results. When the research papers were published, the discoveries carried foreign names. When patents were filed, African institutions were absent. Traoré's challenge was immense. Confronting global biotech powerhouses risked sanctions, loss of aid, and diplomatic isolation. But he pressed on. He established the Burkina Genomic Sovereignty Task Force, a national committee charged with cataloging all biological samples collected within the country. Every vial, every tissue, every strand of genetic material was to be logged and traced. He announced that no foreign partnership would proceed unless it included African data storage, African ownership, and African scientists at every stage of analysis. In early 2025, Burkina Faso hosted a historic summit. Delegates from Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad gathered to discuss a new continental framework, the African Genetic Sovereignty Accord. The goal, to declare Africa's genetic material a strategic natural resource protected under national and continental law. In his opening remarks, Traoré said, "They extract our DNA to build their future. We must protect it to build ours." The reaction from the West was swift. Biotech corporations dismissed the claims as misunderstandings. Officials spoke of partnerships for progress. But leaked documents from several corporations told a different story, one of lobbying to maintain unrestricted access to biological material from developing countries. By 2030, global revenues from genetic patents were projected to surpass $2 trillion. The foundation of that wealth was biological diversity, and no continent had more of it than Africa. Its people carried genetic markers linked to immunity, adaptation, and resilience, traits that biotech companies needed to build future medicine and synthetic biology. Africa's genetic diversity was, quite literally, the blueprint for the future of humanity. In labs around the world, advanced AI systems analyzed African DNA, identifying rare alleles that could fight diseases, tolerate heat, and resist environmental changes. This data was being turned into proprietary technologies, vaccines, treatments, even genetically modified crops, with little to no recognition or compensation to the source nations. Traoré's decree changed that. In April 2025, he signed the Burkina Faso Genomic Protection Law, making it illegal to export biological samples without government authorization. It required all foreign institutions to store duplicate copies of their research data within the country. Violations carried heavy fines and criminal penalties. For the first time, a nation had drawn a line, not on maps, but in blood. Soon after, Mali introduced its Genetic Data Protection Act, and Niger announced plans for an African-owned biobank, a secure repository of continental genetic material. Grassroots movements across Africa adopted a powerful slogan, "Our blood, our code, our future." The movement was quiet but unstoppable. Africa, long the subject of study, was becoming the author of its own scientific narrative. Critics in the West accused these nations of scientific nationalism, arguing that limiting data exchange would slow global health progress. But African leaders countered. What progress, and for whom? The continent that provided the samples was rarely the one that received the cures. For centuries, Africa's relationship with the outside world had been defined by extraction, first of people, then of minerals, then of resources. Now it was of biology. Traoré's stand marked a shift from passive provider to active protector. By mid-2025, the African Union tabled a resolution to classify genetic data as shared continental heritage. The resolution passed with near-unanimous support. It stated that Africa's biological resources, human, animal, and plant, were to be protected under continental law, and any use required express consent and equitable benefit sharing. For many, it was the first step toward what some called genetic independence. The economic stakes were enormous. Pharmaceutical giants suddenly faced new legal barriers. Seed and biotech companies that relied on African genetic data had to renegotiate access agreements, often at great cost. The balance of power had shifted, slightly but symbolically. International media called it the genetic revolution of Africa. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, it was seen differently. To ordinary citizens, it was about dignity, the right to control what flows from their own veins. A student in Dakar told a journalist, "Our DNA is our last resource. If we lose that, we lose who we are." The movement spread beyond politics. African universities began building independent genomic research centers. Local scientists trained in data science and bioinformatics. Diaspora researchers returned home, drawn by the vision of a continent reclaiming its scientific destiny. Documentaries and think tank discussions debated whether Africa's stand could inspire similar moves in Asia and Latin America, regions with their own histories of biological exploitation. The world was watching closely. By 2026, Burkina Faso's National Biobank was operational, a state-of-the-art facility managed by local scientists. Every sample collected in hospitals was tagged, stored, and tracked. Foreign researchers could access data, but only through transparent, government-approved channels. Traoré's bold stand had not gone unnoticed. Some Western nations quietly admired his courage. Others saw him as a disruptor. International funding slowed, some aid programs were paused, but domestic innovation began to grow. African startups emerged in genomics, agricultural biotech, and medical data systems, industries once monopolized by the West. The shift was philosophical as much as political. Sovereignty, once defined by borders and armies, was now about data, biological data. And at the heart of it stood a continent that refused to be a specimen again. In his 2026 address to the African Assembly, Traoré's tone was firm but visionary. They called it cooperation. We call it colonization. They studied our genes to patent our future, but our DNA belongs to our mothers, our fathers, and the soil that gave us life. Africa's code will not be for sale. As the applause echoed through the assembly hall, the world began to understand the magnitude of his words. This was not anti-science. It was science with sovereignty. Not isolation, but independence. From the savannas of Niger to the laboratories of South Africa, a quiet pride began to grow. For the first time in generations, Africa was not being studied, it was studying itself. The story of Africa's genetic sovereignty is not over. Challenges remain, from funding to infrastructure, from global pressure to internal politics. But the seed has been planted. It is a seed of awareness, rooted in history and nourished by resilience. A reminder that colonization does not always come with armies. Sometimes it comes with contracts. And on that day, when Africa stood for its DNA, the world witnessed a different kind of revolution. Not of violence, but of knowledge. Not of territory, but of truth. The day Africa fought for its DNA was the day it reclaimed its future. And the echoes of that stand will shape the course of science for generations to